Lee Hamilton on Tuesday, and he told me how when he was in high school, your father reffed a lot of basketball games, and every time he reffed a game, his team won. Why don't you talk a little bit about your father and your family? I guess your folks were school teachers. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
You know, I guess my dad was the greatest man I've ever met. He had coached 4 sports over at Indiana State, and I grew up loving athletics as a result, of course. And amazing, he walked down Main Street of Terre Haute, Indiana, people be coming across the street. He just had a personality that just wouldn't stop. And, you know, he inculcated in me the fact that you have to try as hard as you can. But if you lose, then as long as you play the game well, you have to be satisfied. Well, I never got to the place I was satisfied to lose, but it did help if you played well.
I understand I'm told he still holds the record for reffing the most Indiana state championship games.
Yeah, he reffed 10 final games, and I guess he's in the Indiana Hall of Fame, Basketball Hall of Fame. And that was really before I was old enough to remember. I'm sorry about that. I did see him referee one football game on a very cold day, I recall.
Well, I think it was Bob Boxell told me yesterday that they sent him a contract for another year beyond the years to do another one, and he thought he could probably do it, but he wasn't absolutely sure. And he said, I don't want to coach I don't want to ref a game where I make a call that's a bad call, and it's because I couldn't keep up. I don't mind making bad calls. But, so he retired on his own terms, which is, I guess, always good.
You know, when I was running around over the state, I ran into a lot of people like Lee who had experienced Dad's refereeing skills. It's hard to believe a referee really being popular. We tend to look at them as traffic cops, which we really shouldn't. And but he had a way of calling a foul on a boy and saying and telling him what he did wrong. And apparently people really liked him. I mean, I loved him, of course. I was prejudiced about it. But the only person I ever heard say anything negative about my dad was at the beginning of my first session in the legislature. The Indiana Mental Health Association was just beginning to function, and it sponsored a large dinner there in the old Riley room of the old Claypool Hotel, which is no longer with us. And all of us were lined up in a receiving line in which Governor George Craig was the main host. And I'd never met him before, and I stuck out my hand and I said, "Hi, Governor, I'm Birch Bayh." He said, "Oh, your father's the only person that ever threw me out of a football game." Well, you know, what do you say to that? Well, I said, "Well, Governor, I guess you deserved it, right?" And he said, "Humph." next hand.
And you got involved in politics rather early, even as a student leader, I suppose, right?
Well, I really had never thought much about politics, and finally some folks persuaded me to run for president of the senior class, so I began to learn some of the basics. And I think that's probably where I got the in right there to run for the state legislature later on. But I think it's the theory and the practice are very much the same, whether you're running for president of the student body or president of the United States, really. Of course, it's a much different league.
But it wasn't too long afterwards that you ran for the legislature and served with people like Wayne Townsend. Then you became speaker, right? The youngest speaker in Indiana history, is that right?
So I'm told. I never did correct the record. I was 30 at the time. I just happened to be the right place at the right time, I think. Back in those days, the legislature was so malapportioned The Democrats seldom controlled anything. Every 10 years they would control the House, and I happened to be minority leader the year before, and suddenly there was a tremendous national swing in 1958. There was a recession there, and we went from, I think, 24 to 71 members of the House, and they were kind enough to elect me Speaker, which was really quite a challenge. Here I was still wet behind the ears, and a lot of those members were old enough to be my father, at least, maybe my grandfather, and most of them had never held public office in their lives. So it was quite a challenge. We had very young leadership. Don Foltz was a majority leader. He was maybe 33, and Bob Rock from Anderson was 32. And the state chairman called us the Diaper Patrol. He didn't much care for some of our ideas, like having popular vote for senator and for nominations and governor, which ultimately came to pass.
Well, there was clearly kind of a generational change underway in those times, and as evidenced by the election of President Kennedy in 1960. People in Indiana still talk about that 1962 U.S. Senate race almost in reverential terms. It's like you almost, in the same league as, Magic versus Bird in the, college championship game. They talk about it almost like it's the most legendary political race in memory. What you weren't supposed to even win the nomination, were you?
Well, some of the powers that be were backing Mayor Boswell, Charlie Boswell, very nice gentleman, ultimately became postmaster. In fact, I helped appoint him postmaster. But it was a four-way race, really, and I'd been running longer than anybody else had. I just went out and started talking to people down in places like Corydon and down on the river, and every place I could go had a list of delegates to the last convention, and this was before popular vote, of course. And I started talking to them, and first time people really had that kind of personal attention that far ahead of the convention. And I think we had developed a groundswell of, yeah, we need a young guy, and yes, we like this young fellow. And ultimately, it was strong enough that Governor Welch, shortly before the convention, nominated me, and that was the end of it as far as the nomination process is concerned.
But that was a little different than what people were used to, wasn't it? Before that time, often the decisions were made from the top down. This was from the bottom up, from the grassroots up, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. In fact, that was our theory. We knew that the people that had the ultimate political power, like the governor and some of the large city mayors, Evansville and East Chicago, Gary, and some of those places, Terre Haute for that matter, although they were for me over there. But usually they would send down the word and everybody else would be in lockstep. But we thought if we got out and started talking to people in the small counties, well, I mentioned Corydon, Harrison County, for example. The county chairman was for me. Bob O'Bannon, who was the late governor's father, had served in the legislature for me. So early on, the Corydon Democrat ran an editorial supporting Birch Bayh before anybody knew who he was. So they only had 10 delegates. But those 10 and 10 others, and the people who really didn't have the major political clout were willing to make personal decisions because what they believed themselves. And our theory was based on the fact if you get enough of those people, when you get closer enough of those people for you, when you get closer to the nominating process and the powers that be begin listening, they'll hear all those voices for Birch Bayh. And it worked. And we had a lot of wonderful people helping us. I mean, I could never have made that without myself. Young people, not so young people. We had, I think, almost every member, female member of the state committee was for us. And we had some young people who'd just gotten out of college. One, Bob Henshaw, who drove me 80,000 miles in a Mercury. He dropped out of Rose Poly. And He and Bob Boxell and Larry Conrad and Boxell were the campaign managers. They came to me and asked if they could manage that stage of the game. You know, I could stand to pay them what they asked, namely nothing, as far as the salary was concerned. And we had a bunch of what some people would call ragtag volunteers, but we had a pretty good idea of what we wanted to do, and as it turned out, we were successful, but not by a large margin.
And Welch's endorsement.
Sorry to interrupt. Senator, why don't you have a little sip of water? You sound like you're getting a little hoarse.
All right?
Thank you.
That's a good idea because I need to lubricate him once in a while. You want to repeat any of that, or?
No.
Excuse me.
And Governor Welch's endorsement was really, he didn't have to go out on a limb at that point much because your supporters were barraging him or his staff with requests that he in fact endorsed. It looked like you were, by the point he endorsed it, it almost looked like you were going to win anyway, didn't it?
Well, if the convention had been left open, I think we would have won very handily. But usually that isn't the way it was. And Matt Welch was a friend of mine. We'd served in the legislature together. In fact, as minority leader in the 61 session of the legislature, I did everything I could to get Governor Welch's program passed through a Republican House. And I remember a good old Republican friend of mine who was a majority leader, Glenn Slinker, rolled his chair across the aisle to me and he said, "Birch, when are you going to start passing the governor's program?" And I said, "Well, Glenn, we just passed one yesterday and you were a co-sponsor to it." So we were really helping Matt, and so I think he, in his heart of hearts, he would like to have been for me, but he had some people around him who really thought that the politics of being able to get the mayor of Indianapolis, maybe that would carry all the legislation in the Indianapolis area, and that would be helpful to maintain the patronage instead of who was elected senator. I don't think anybody doubted the fact that I could probably run a better race against Homer Capehart, but Matt, I think I'd talked to him early on and ask his advice periodically. And he was rather wise, and I was telling him what I was doing and who was for me. And he said, "Birch, are you asking the right question?" I said, "What do you mean, Matt?" He said, "Well, they'll tell you you're nice young people, a nice young person, and you'd be a good senator, and everybody back home likes you. But the question is, will you be voting for me for delegate? If the answer is yes, you know you have a commitment, because politics, even with the reputation it has, when somebody tells you they're going to do something, usually they do."
Now, Henshaw told me a story that you were in Wayne County in Richmond, and at some rally, and you were at some point getting a little bored with it and decided to go bowling. Do you remember that?
I think that was after the rally.
Oh, was that after the rally?
Yeah.
And you encountered some delegates?
Yeah. I think this was a women's league, and there were a couple of 3 delegates in the various teams. I mean, I was shaking hands with everybody, and as I recall, I loved to bowl. I was fairly decent at it, but we didn't have any bowling shoes. So I took off my shoes and thought I'll do it in my socks. This was before you could rent bowling shoes at the counter. And the first time I came down the lane with the ball went one way and I fell right on my rear end and slid toward the duck pins and the 10 pins. And it was quite a talking point. It didn't show me at my best, but I guess it showed me my ability to get up and go on and do what needed to be done, namely shake hands with everybody in the bowling alley that night.
And you won some people over.
I think so. Most people like to feel that you're much like them. Unfortunately, some politicians have airs that they're a little superior or a little separate and apart. And you mentioned the political rally. You know, I never aided a political rally. I tried to shake hands with everybody that was there, and let them know I needed their help and was grateful for them. And I think most people appreciated that one-on-one. That was what was me then, and that's what I am today, I hope.
What was your strategy against Capehart, who was, after all, an entrenched, well-known, and wealthy incumbent? That had to be viewed as something of a long shot.
Well, it was impossible. All the pundits thought it was impossible. In fact, I remember 2 weeks before election, Jep Kudu, who was the dean of the press corps in Indiana, usually he would go across the state 2 weeks before election, and then he'd make a prophecy. And the headlines of his prophecy in the newspaper was, Capehart by 100,000. And in the context of the article, he praised me and said what a good campaign I was running, and that people thought if I'd cut the margin to 50,000, then I'd be the candidate for governor 2 years later. I didn't want to be governor. I never did want to be governor. I respected the governor, but all my experience was a legislative experience. And but Jep didn't think we could win. Nobody thought we could win, and we just barely won at the end. And right at the tail end, we had this Cuban Missile Crisis. And Senator Capehart had been one of the early proponents of invading Cuba. He wanted to send in the Marines, even before there were any missiles there. So when the missiles showed up, then he said, I told you so. Maybe he eased up in his campaigning. I always think maybe he did, because when you come that close, a little bit of extra effort could make a difference. We never stopped.
Now, in that campaign, there's a kind of a memorable campaign tune that some people around the state still have copies, like it's an Elvis record or something. Why don't you talk a little bit about that campaign jingle and how that came about?
Well, it was an amazing piece of work. We had been looking for some sort of a theme song, so my name could be better known. Capehart was known by about 85% of the people. He'd been there for 18 years, and only about 23% of the people knew who Birch Bayh was. And we had another problem. For the first time in history, I was at plant gates early in the morning shaking hands with people asking for their vote, both going and coming. And I had experience after experience where I'd stick out a hand and shake hands with the fella, and his face would light up, and he'd say, I've never had anybody ask me for their vote. You know, I would have said, I'm Birch Bayh. And he'd say, well, I'll vote for you, Bert. And we could see people going to look for Bert, and Bayh, B-A-Y-H doesn't make Bayh in most people's mind, and they'd wonder what happened to our old friend Bert. So we had to do something to get people to understand that B-A-Y-H was Bayh. And this theme song did it magnificently. I mean, I remember we'd been out on a campaign trail, and we came into our digs in the top floor of the old Severn Hotel, which was, the pigeons were on the roost outside, and it was one of those things that we were donated by the people that we could use it. So we were living off the land, and that was a great place to stay. But Bob Henshaw parked her car downstairs. We came up to this room, and there were Boxall and Conrad sitting around looking like the cat that had swallowed the canary. And there in the middle of bed was this big box, which was a tape recorder of that day and age, not like they have them right now. And he said, we got something we want you to listen to. So they turned it on, and there was Mary Lou Conrad, who had come up with all the words and had chosen the jingle, Hey, Look Me Over. And I listened to that 2 times, and I got a lump in my throat. I immediately went to the telephone, and I called Marvella. And I said, honey, I want you to listen to this. So she listened to it, and she said, what do you think? She said, I think that's it. I said, I agree. Let's go. So we decided to go forward, And later that very evening, we were going to go to Margaret Atlas Johnson, Dick the Bruiser, a famous wrestler. She was our national committee woman, wonderful lady. She was the only person we knew that had a library in her house. And we wanted to have cut a spot with me sitting behind the desk, very senatorial, saying something. I don't even remember what it was. But we'd taken this recorder along because we wanted the fellow who was handling our PR to hear it. And so we turned it on, went through the 2 times, said, "What do you think?" He said, "It'll never sell." And we went along, we cut one series of, this was back in the old days where they had film, and while he was replacing the canister of films into the camera, he was whistling "Hey, Look Me Over." And I said, "Bob, you know what you're whistling?" He said, "I'll be darned." They took it to Chicago, and the Marlboro girl that sang all the Marlboro commercials did a fantastic job, and the lighting and the theatrics, the way they cut and pasted various shots of me. I mean, it won the national prize, #1 prize in the country for a commercial spot, not just a political spot, but of all commercial spots, that was the #1 prize.
Chris, obviously during that siren it was intrusive, so I'm assuming that you were satisfied with what came after.
I'm trying to remember it. We had a little bit away for.
No, it was the
before
real
that, I
big
think.
honk
Pardon?
siren. The real big honk siren that was
Yeah.
out there was the one that.
We have some audio interference.
That's good. Okay, let me.
Well, including why we needed it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we all right?
Yeah, we're fine. We're fine. I was going to reset and something somewhere. Okay, I'm rolling.
Okay.
Well, early on in the campaign, we realized we had a recognition problem. That Senator Capehart had been in the Senate for 18 years, and he had 85% name recognition in the polls that we saw, and I only had 23%. This was compounded by the fact that the people had trouble with my last name and my first name, Birch Bayh. There aren't too many Birches around, and there aren't very many Bayhs around. I would be standing at a plant gate early in the morning shaking hands with people, and I'd shake hands with somebody and say, "Hi, I'm Birch Bayh. I'd like to have your vote for senator." The guy's face would light up, and he'd say, "Oh, you're the first person that's asked me for your vote. You've got my vote, Birch." Well, we could see a lot of those Birch going in to vote for their friend Bert, and they'd see this Birch Bayh fella, because B-A-Y-H doesn't make Bayh, and they'd wonder what happened to their friend Bert. So we had to do something, one, to get the recognition across the board and get the pronunciation of the name down. And so we tried various schemes of various songs, and Henshaw and I were riding across the southern landscape going from South Bend to Fort Wayne. Usually he would drive and I'd sleep in the back seat. But before I got in the back seat, I think it was Fred Waring came on with the choir singing, "Hey, Look Me Over." And Henshaw said, "You know, I think we ought to use that for a campaign song. I think George Romney used that in Michigan." I said, "Well, if George Romney used it, we couldn't do it." And I went to sleep. Then it was about less than a week later, same scenario, Henshaw at the wheel. "Here, Hey, Look Me Over" comes on the radio again. And he said, "Well, I still think we ought to use that as a campaign song." And I said, "Well, okay, check it out." And Henshaw said, "Well, I can just hear the first line." We were handing out throwaway pamphlets that had a big steelworker with a pot on his head, big smile, and out of his mouth was coming, "He's my kind of guy." And Henshaw said, "I can just hear it now. Hey, look me over. He's my kind of guy." And half asleep, I said, "Yeah, and I suppose the next line will be his first name is Birch and his last name is Bayh." And I went to sleep. About a week later, Bob Henshaw pulls the campaign car up to the Old Severn Hotel where we had digs on the top floor. And when we got up to the top floor and went into our room, there was Bob Henshaw with me, with Bob Boxall and Larry Conrad, who were the campaign managers, sat there as looked like a cat that had found a canary. And there on the bed was this big box tape recorder of that day and age. Said, "We have something here we want you to hear." So they played it. 2 times through, it was Mary Lou Conrad had sat down at the piano and put together "Hey, Look Me Over," and there it came, 2 times through. I got a big lump in my throat because it seemed like this was what we were looking for. I went to the phone, called Marvella, said, "Honey, I have something here I want you to hear." They played it through 2 times for her, and I said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think that's it." I said, "Okay, let's go." And I came back and said, "Okay, guys, let's go." Well, the fellow that was running our publicity for the campaign had arranged for us to cut a political spot at Margaret Atlas Johnson's house. She was the wife of mother of Dick the Bruiser. Wonderful woman. She was our national committee woman, and she was the only person we knew that actually had a library. So the theory was that I'd sit behind this desk looking very senatorial and say something profound, and then we'd put that into a spot and run it on the television. Before we started this, while the fellow who was our publicity guy was putting his camera together, they said, "Look, I want you to hear something." So we played it again 2 times. He said, "That'll never fly." Then he went about cutting the spot. After we'd run out of film, while he was refilling the camera with film, he was whistling "Hey, Look Me Over." And I said, "Bob, do you know what you're whistling?" Oh, my goodness. So the long story is already too long, but to get to the point, they took it to an ad agency in Chicago. They got the Marlboro girl who sang the Marlboro commercials in that day and age, and they made a commercial that you cannot believe. They cut shots and had me throwing up a child and talking to a senior citizen, and in all phases of the campaign. And it was so good that it won the first prize for a commercial spot in the whole United States. It was "Hey, Look Me Over." Not just a political spot, but a commercial spot. First prize. And what that did, of course, was immediately people began associating me with that jingle in a very this was totally positive, as anybody recalls. It made you happy inside, and we didn't know whether it would work or not. And I had various instances where we was at a Dairy Queen with we had a station wagon at that time that had "Buy for Senator" on the side, and Bob Henshaw and I were sitting there eating an ice cream cone, and a couple of kids walked by and said, "You know who that is, don't you?" The other guy said, "Yeah, he's the guy we're supposed to look over." We have stories. Some of my friends that had to be Republican precinct committeemen said we couldn't keep our kids from singing the song, jumping up and down in front of the television. It was just an infectious kind of thing in a very positive way.
But, okay, we're going to...
What Rich Daniels did 34 years ago, I'm concerned about what he did last year in the deficit, you know.
Exactly. That's got to be the message. Are we rolling?
Yep, we're rolling.
Okay. Now, the backdrop of the Cuban Missile Crisis obviously was, and you talked a little bit about that, but I want to get back to that. Capehart, as you mentioned, was one of President Kennedy's most severest critics on that. Now, when the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, what did that do to your campaign? What was your reaction? Were you feeling that it may be bad news, and what did you do then to try to deal with that?
Let me put this in proper perspective, if I may, because Birch Bayh was in the Cuban Missile Crisis up to his eyeballs. President Kennedy was persuaded to come out and have a airport rally in Indianapolis. Now, he'd been destroyed in Indiana in the election. Nixon just defeated him handily. And our theory was, since this was an off-year election, what we needed to do was to stimulate the troops, to make sure that all the Democrats got out to vote, and nobody could do that quite like the President of the United States. So on the appointed Saturday, I flew to Pittsburgh, where President Kennedy had been campaigning with Governor David Lawrence of Pennsylvania. I got on Air Force One and then flew into the Indianapolis airport so I could get off the plane with the president. Big deal. Well, he gave a speech that was a barn burner. I mean, he came out for me all fours. And he went down the litany of education, health care. Where was Indiana's vote? Voting no. We need somebody to vote yes. And it was such an unqualified endorsement. But you may recall in the 13 days, Bobby and Kenny O'Donnell. Bobby and Kenny O'Donnell were discussing it, and the question of going to Indiana comes up, and Bobby said, well, we can never carry Indiana. Birch Bayh can never carry Indiana, but it'll get us good practice in the for the next 64 election, which sort of a throwaway, but that was within the first 2 or 3 minutes of the film. Well, from my perspective, Kennedy got back on the airplane, came down with the cold, canceled his next stop, and went back to Washington, which tells me that when he got back on that plane, he knew that there were problems in Cuba. I don't think he knew that at the time of the speech, because he came out and scalded Senator Capehart. We don't need armchair generals that will send other sons into battle. I mean, no, that was an exact line, because Capehart had wanted to invade Cuba long before there were any missiles. So that was very much an issue in the campaign. And when that happened, I must say in my heart of hearts, I thought that was the end of the campaign. But since I was leading the ticket, I couldn't let anybody know I believed that. So with the exception of pulling into a Holiday Inn down in Jasper, I think, at the exact time that our destroyers were going to meet that Russian freighter that had missiles on it, we got in, and I called the White House to see what was happening. And the president must have felt personally responsible, because apparently the moment after he made this was on Monday, after he'd been to Indiana, and he had this, what I call Black Monday, where at 6 o'clock he told America that we had this Cuban Missile problem, and that he mobilized the National Guard, and he did a lot of things to show, put the quarantine on as far as shipping is concerned. And apparently after that he turned to Kenny O'Donnell and said, well, we had just defeated Birch Bayh and re-elected Senator Capehart. And, but the Kennedy White House kept in touch with me right on through the campaign. In fact, I remember we'd flown a helicopter into Michigan City, and I was down visiting with the football team that was practicing one afternoon, and some guy came running out of under the locker room and said, hey, somebody wants to talk to Birch Bayh. It's the White House. And so it was Ted Thornton. He said, the president wants you to know what's happening. The quarantine is working. They're turning the ships back, and we have every reason to believe they're going to take the missiles out. But we just want you to know. And so that was small comfort, because this had given Senator Capehart the option of, he then sagely said, well, I've been telling you so all along. Well, all along wasn't true, because the missiles had only gotten in there just a few days before. And so what do you do about something like that? We had a group of very dedicated people who, the Saturday before the Cuban Missile Crisis, in fact, the Sunday before the Cuban Missile Crisis, had met in one of the law firms in downtown Indianapolis. Merle Miller was leading the charge for us at that time. God rest his soul, a great human being, a great lawyer, and a great Democrat. His wife, Ophelia, was the first volunteer we had in our campaign. But he had hosted this, and we had a number of people there, in which Bob Risk was one of the prominent ones. And they had, I'd made a pitch to them early in the morning, and I'd said they wondered what they could do, and I mentioned the fact that this Nixon telethon had been so positive in the 60 election that it was attributed to making such a close race, and one which Nixon almost won. Maybe we could try something like that. And then I went on and campaigned and came back about 7 o'clock at night. And the message was that we have pledged to raise $70,000, which was, that day and age, like $700,000. And we're going to arrange to have a whole group of telethons all over the state. We'll have some, only one of them was in prime time, but the others were just after the mothers take their kids to school, or just before they go to pick them up, or in the evening just after the news. And we had 90-some hours of telethons in which people could call in and ask questions. And what that did was give us the opportunity to answer the tough questions. What about Cuba? And we were able to distinguish between a senator who wanted to send in the Marines and get boys killed, and a president who got the missiles out of there without scratching a person. And and the name got better known. They were tough bargainers, though, the group. Even after the Cuban Missile Crisis, they said, okay, we're going to stay by the pledge. We're going to raise the $70,000. I think they probably thought they were throwing it down the gutter, but they did. And they said, we'll do that under one occasion. You have to stop going to these plant gates early in the morning. We want you to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, so to speak. You need to think so you'll know exactly how to respond to these questions. I said, okay, that's a deal.
And
Hang on a second, please.
Without that, I would never have had any. To me, living over on the...
Yeah, hold on a second.
To me, my experience with disasters had been growing up in western Indiana on the banks of the Wabash, and when the Wabash flooded, we had a disaster. And it wasn't until that Palm Sunday that are we on camera now?
we were on? Okay.
Why don't you start? I'll
Yeah,
just...
1965, Palm Sunday. Terrible, terrible day in Indiana. I remember that day. One of you, and you came out, you brought President Johnson out. And what happened? I mean, there's something that, as a result of that, there's something that people in Florida now benefit this week. So.
Well, Palm Sunday in 1965 was a disaster, a catastrophe of monumental proportions, particularly in northern Indiana. There'd been two twisters that hit, one up around Carmel and the one up toward Fort Wayne, and the other one that was up in Mishawaka, Elkhart. Dunlop was a particularly place where a whole bunch of people were killed because they were in a trailer camp. And it was devastation, and to me this was a totally new definition of disaster. Living over on the banks of the Wabash in western Indiana, a disaster was when the Wabash flooded. But this was something that just was unbelievable, and the day after it happened, I got into an Army Corps helicopter and went over there and toured the places and saw the people with chainsaws digging themselves out of a crisis. That the amazing thing when there's a disaster like that, people pull together that normally would not pull together, but they were working hard up there, and we got to exploring what we could do to help them. And the question was almost nothing. The whole disaster program at that time was designed to help rebuild or refurbish public structures, roads, courthouses, bridges, of course, that those could get federal assistance, but nothing to help the people. And so what would happen when a disaster would strike, the congressman affected would introduce a Beulah disaster bill. And then after the fact, they would provide relief for that moment. There was nothing in place to come to the immediate rescue. So my staff and I put together a very comprehensive disaster program. And I was on the Public Works Committee. I persuaded our chairman, Jennings Randolph, to establish a new subcommittee on disasters and make me chairman of it. And we put that bill into that committee, got it out, passed it through the Senate. This bill would have put down, basically it was the foundation on which FEMA exists now, but that was the first time we had anything like that, where the aid was there to help people that had small businesses, that had the roof blown off their barn or their house, or you know, you can have all the insurance you want, but if all you have left is a hole in a mortgage, you're in really trouble. So we tried to put together a comprehensive program, which basically, because I was chairman, and nobody else cared a whole lot about it, it went through the Senate almost unanimously. The House had a bill that dealt with a disaster that had occurred during the same period in Texas. And the congressman had introduced the bill to help the victims of that one tornado after the fact. And we sat there. This was on through August. We sat there in this conference committee. The House wouldn't budge. I wouldn't budge. And finally, just before Labor Day, everybody wanted to go home and get out of there. They said, well, Birch, why don't you, let's just take this Texas bill now, and then we can come back right after Labor Day, and we'll work on yours. And I said, well, fellows, what would happen if we had a disaster while we're at home and we haven't done anything about it? Don't you know, while we were home, Camille came raging up through the Gulf, hit Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, great devastation like they hadn't seen in years. And when we came back after Labor Day, it took about 30 minutes to get that bill passed. And that was provided the running gears on which now, subsequent years, they put together a very comprehensive FEMA program, which is exactly what it should be. I mean, we had in the bill for the first time warning systems to let people know what was about to happen. And as I look back on it, that was a very fortuitous situation where I just happened to be in the place where we could turn the disaster into an opportunity to help deal with the problems like those that exist in Florida right now.
1964, you were invited to speak to Massachusetts Democratic Party.
Mm-hmm.
You got on a plane with Senator Kennedy and flew up there, and what happened?
Well, I'll always remember that day. It was June 7th of 1964. We had been working on the civil rights bills for a long period of time, and the leadership had determined it was going to pass that bill if they had to work all night. Well, prior to that time, Senator Kennedy, who had been elected the same year I was elected, but he was elected for the 2-year unexpired term of his brother, the president, and they put a fellow by the name of Ben Smith in, but they had to elect a successor 2 years later. And Ted asked me to come up and keynote the convention, which was held out at Springfield. And so he and I were standing around the well wondering when we're going to get a vote, when we're going to get a vote. We had really talked to the convention early on in the evening, or late in the afternoon. Told them we were on our way. Well, we left about 7 o'clock in a small plane, and we knew we had some weather problems, but the long and the short of it was that the pilot who had 10,000 miles on that plane, I think, felt pressure to land 2 United States senators a place they had to land, and wasn't as cautious as he should have been, and he unfortunately paid for it with his life, landing about a mile short of the Springfield National Guard runway, which had absolutely no instrumentation at all. And when we got out of that plane, the pilot was killed. Ted Kennedy's chief of staff ultimately died an hour later after he'd gotten to the hospital. Ted's back was broken. In fact, Marvell and I, at least I was unconscious, and she was injured, broke her coccyx, her tailbone. And I sort of awakened, became conscious, and heard her screaming, and I said, let's get the hell out of here. And fortunately, the plane is designed so that when there's a crash, the window pops out. So we were able to climb out of that window down over the wreckage of the plane. And I walked around to the front of it and saw that we had what I thought were 2 dead people, ultimately turned out to be dead people. And I came back and yelled for Ted, and nothing happened, not a sound. And we decided we'd go for help. And as we started down the hill, I smelled these gasoline fumes. I mean, we were covered with gasoline. In fact, 2 weeks later, when we went home from the hospital, opened our luggage, the gasoline fumes came out. Why it didn't blow up, I don't know. When we started, and I decided I had to go back. I told Marvella we had to go back. I had to make one last try for Ted. You go on for help. She said, no. If you're going to go back there, I'm going to go back there. She just told me that I might die. So that was small comfort, but it had to be done. And when I yelled this time, there was a groan. And I could see Ted holding out his hand. I can see it now, right now. He had white French cuffs on. I wrestled him out of there, and we got him out on the ground. And, talk about adrenaline taking charge. Adrenaline must have been what took hold of me, that plus the help of the old man upstairs, because he's a pretty heavy guy, and I lugged him out, carrying him under my right arm. We laid him down. 30 minutes later, I couldn't use that arm, and I couldn't walk. They had to put me in a wheelchair. Now, long and short of it is we were able to save Ted's life, and I was fortunate to be there at that time, but it was a tragic experience to have the loss of life that occurred.
He jokes that his back was fine until you pulled him out.
That could well be. It was his head I was worried about, not his back.
Now, you were, when you got into the Senate, there were some real giants in the U.S. Senate. And you were pretty young, and what was that like? People that must have been your heroes, Hubert Humphrey and people like that.
Well, it was an unbelievable experience. And even to this day, and the last day I was in the Senate, I'd look up at that seal and still pinch myself 18 years later that I was really there. And I determined that since I think Ted was the youngest and I was the second youngest, I said I had to be certain that everybody there knew that I didn't think I had all the answers, and I started calling people like Dick Russell and going to see him, and Willis Robertson, and of course Senator Kennedy. Went to see the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, who took Marvell and me home for dinner that night, but tried to develop a relationship where my colleagues knew that they were working with someone who wanted to hear their opinions and didn't have all the answers. But in a way, I guess he found out was determined to follow what he thought was right, which I think is what most of the members do. Even if you disagree with them, you should not disagree with their motivation.
In fact, you actually became pretty close to President Johnson.
That was one of almost a unique experience, because we felt very close to President Kennedy. I mean, day after the election, after we'd gone down the main street of Terre Haute, Indiana, and with the fire engine and everything else, we got home and were having lunch, and there was a knock on the front door, and it was fire chief, no, the chief of police, Frank Riddle. And Marvella had turned off the phones, and we wanted to get away from everybody. She was rather disgusted when she went to the door and said, "Hello, Chief, how are you?" So, "Miss Bayh, I have a phone message here for you." And she said, "Well, thank you very much. I'll put it at the bottom of the pile." And said, "Miss Bayh, with all respect, I think if you look at that message, maybe you want to put it closer to the top." And there was President Kennedy calling. After swearing that she would not do anything to interrupt our lunch, she said, "Okay, you can return the call, provided I can listen in on the extension." So I remember got the White House operator, and the first words I heard were from John Kennedy when the president was saying, "Hey, Birch, how'd you do it, you old miracle maker?" And so we had a very close relationship. He had Marvell and me, with 2 or 3 other young senators and their wives, up to the residence part of the White House at the top floor. And I felt very close to the president. But when he died, prior to that time, we developed a close relationship with the vice president. He'd had us out to his house in Elms for dinner a couple of times, and I think he took a look at him, liking the Marvella, and had to put up with me. But when the president died, that loyalty turned over to the president. I mean, I didn't think it was, you had to choose. Most people in town were either Kennedy people or Johnson people. And I didn't think that was the way you run a rodeo. I mean, you try to get along with both sides. But there was very intense feelings that go back to the pre-convention period where Johnson was running against President Kennedy. And I don't think Bobby Kennedy ever got over that, although I developed and continued to have a close relationship with Bobby till the day he died. In fact, he came to the Senate, when I was there.
Marvella Bayh was respected in her own right, not just in Indiana, but didn't President Johnson want to make her chair of the DNC at one point? What happened? What was that?
Well, first let me say about Marvella. I think she, to a very great extent, made me what I am today. Here was a 19-year-old daughter of a wheat farmer who I'd spirited out of the campus of Oklahoma A&M to my corn and soybean farm. And we both knew that we wanted to get involved some way in public policy to help people, to make the world a little better place. And we were idealistic and didn't believe it couldn't be done. And in so many ways, she was my closest advisor, and particularly she had been discriminated against. The University of Virginia didn't accept her application because women need not apply. And in her eyes, as we went through life together, from time to time, she would remind me of what it was like to be a woman in a man's world. And if it hadn't been for her, I would not have been in the leadership role as I was in Title IX of the Higher Education Act, equal rights for education, equal rights for women. All of those things were the product of Marvella's coaching and tutoring and her personal experience. And she had a feeling, an understandable feeling, that she understood that I was relying on her. She was my closest confidant. But she said, when we have differences of opinion, you're the one who votes. And there was all in her heart, there was a little feeling of, well, I'm the wife of, instead of somebody in my own right. And President Johnson did ask her if she would accept the position of vice chairman of the National Party, something she really wanted to do. But my political advisors at the time, Voxel and Conrad and others, thought that this would be very difficult for me running for re-election in 1968, which was a presidential year, if it appeared that I and she were national Democrats instead of Indiana Democrats. Well, you know, I really made a mistake there. I should have said to hell with the next election, if you'll pardon my French. If this Marlavella wants this and she's entitled to it, go to it, honey, and do your thing. I didn't say no. I didn't say yes. I kept saying it's your decision. And I made a mistake there. And I was so happy when, after the tragedy of cancer, and her breast cancer, and the Cancer Society asked her to chair the national campaign with Peter Graves that first year, and then put her on the staff to travel all over the country giving lectures and appearing at the banquets and luncheons for women to guide them and teach them the value of self-detection. And she saved countless lives, I'm sure, as a result of that. And for the first time, she was Marvella Bayh, not the wife of Birch Bayh. Not that she wasn't proud of the fact that she was my wife and loved me dearly, but now she had her own thing to do, and she didn't need to get my input from it. And I was so happy for her because, ironically, those 7 years were probably the happiest years of her life because she was doing her own thing at the same time she was a mother and a wife and a part of my senatorial experience.
What kind of campaign, you